Oh, you're slick. You investors in hate. You Saddams and you Bushes. You Bin Ladens and snakes. You billionaire bullies. You're a globalized curse. You put war on the masses and then you clean out the
And now
worst.
live from Studio B in beautiful Redway, California, where it is 41 degrees outside, Mary Massey and Heroes and Patriots.
Happy New Year and welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. The views and opinions expressed today are not necessarily the board, staff, or volunteers of KMUD. And we have a great show for today. We begin our second year here at the home of KMUD. So thank you for everyone who has helped bring the show together for the last year. Today, as Jordan mentioned, is Thursday, January 2nd, 2020, and we are streaming live from Studio B at KMUD Community Radio here in southern Humboldt County. I am Mary Massey, and co-host John is still away with an injury to his throat, but we wish him well and know he will return soon. This and all programs are archived both here at kmud.org and on our show website, heroespatriots.org. Today, we welcome two prominent guests. In the first half hour, I will be speaking with Dr. David N. Gibbs. Professor Gibbs will speak at length on NATO, its position on nuclear weaponry, Trump and his hot and cold support of NATO, and other issues such as the Arab NATO that Trump is purporting, and then that NATO has declared a space operational domain. In the second half hour, I will be joined by columnist Joseph DeStefano. Mr. DeStefano is a journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer and will discuss his latest article on Joe Biden and the middle class, We encourage listeners to call in or write in with questions for our guest. The number to call, 707-923-3911. If that line is busy, do try again. You may also send your questions to heroesandpatriots@gmail.com, and I will read those on the air. David N. Gibbs is a professor of history at the University of Arizona and has published widely on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and, of course, NATO, which is the topic we will be addressing today. His publications have appeared in both academic and popular venues, such as the London Guardian, Los Angeles Times, and Le Monde Diplomatique. He also recently debated the topic of humanitarian intervention at Oxford Union Society, and Professor Gibbs is currently finishing his third book on the rise of American conservative during the 1970s, to be entitled How America Became a Right-Wing Nation. I know that's going to be an excellent read. With that, I welcome Dr. David N. Gibbs. Okay, so is he with us?
Yep.
Hey, I don't know how much you heard, Dr. Gibbs, but I've done your intro and would like to get right into it.
Yep.
As I mentioned, you have studied and written extensively on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And as I understand it, NATO was established just prior to the Warsaw Pact, which was started right after World War II, given that nuclear weapons were deployed against Japan. Can you describe NATO versus the Warsaw Pact at the time they were established? And was the key issue for both entities nuclear weaponry?
Well, the NATO was established in 1949. It was, the major accomplishment, if you want to call it that, of the Truman administration. And it established, an alliance among the principal nations of Western Europe, as well as Turkey and Canada and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The principal objective, officially, was to dissuade or to repel a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The Soviet Union responded the following year, 1915, creating the Warsaw Pact, creating a NATO-like organization for communist states in Eastern Europe under Soviet tutelage. So you had these two blocs opposing each other pretty much throughout the Cold War until the end of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. And I understand the Warsaw Pact obviously dissolved when the Soviet Union collapsed, but NATO survived. Here we are 70 years later. Mm-hmm. One of the articles, Article 5, is designed to say that given that an attack against one country is an attack against all countries, and NATO member countries were called in to act in unison following the attacks on U.S. soil in 2001. What, if anything, changed with NATO member countries following the 9/11 attacks, and were there any adjustment to the articles?
Well, let's see. I think I'd like to back up a little bit and just note basically what happened after the Cold War. In 1990, the Warsaw Pact did dissolve. The following year, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. And I think there was a widespread perception NATO would go as well because NATO's function had ceased to exist because there was no Soviet threat. There was no Soviet Union, literally. I think Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, was astounded that there was no effort to dissolve NATO. I think there was an assumption NATO would just go. And so NATO, I think, largely continued without a function for an extended period of time, largely as a result of I would say just bureaucratic momentum. You had a lot of interest groups on both sides of the Atlantic, including the uniformed militaries of both U.S. and European states, that had just a vested interest in keeping this institution going, even though it had no function to speak of, really. And I think finding a new function for NATO, including a new enemy, has been a long-standing objective. One of the enemies that had been selected was, of course, international terrorism following the 9/11 terrorist attack in 2001. And mainly this was to be a unilateral U.S. response, which of course it was, but there were some efforts to nominally bring in NATO states at both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which was done, more so in Afghanistan, but also symbolically at least in Iraq. And in both countries, especially in Afghanistan, NATO did facilitate European involvement in what, in retrospect, were disastrous interventions. I think the main carry away I would like to give is basically NATO was, and at the end of the Cold War, and remains an institution largely in search of an enemy. Its principal enemy had disappeared, and it has become an institution searching for a new enemy. Obviously, as I noted, you had terrorism as one enemy. I think more recently, post-communist Russia has emerged much more clearly as the new enemy of NATO. I think the problem with that interpretation is that NATO had largely created Russia as an enemy state. It was threatening nobody until NATO began expanding. So I think, in a lot of ways, NATO is responsible for increasing security threats rather than containing them.
And you've mentioned that, what about the satellite member countries that were affiliated with the Warsaw Pact? Where are they at this point?
Largely, for the most part, I believe all of them, without exceptions that I can think of, were absorbed by NATO. NATO expanded eastward. Eastward expansion became one of the functions of NATO, is incorporating the former communist states of Eastern Europe. Not only Eastern Europe, but also some former Soviet states, including Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were incorporated into NATO as well. And I think a good deal of the U.S. conflict with Russia derives from the expansion of NATO, which they see as a security threat.
And back to my question about new articles written, or is there a formal stance, if you will, in writing that member countries see Russia as the enemy, if you will?
You know, I haven't looked at the NATO articles in a while, and I haven't seen formal changes that I'm aware of offhand that specifically target Russia. But there is no doubt that in the last 10 years, you've had increasing commitment to the idea that contesting Russia is going to be one of the principal, possibly the principal function of NATO in the future. That's been said by numerous times by officials in the U.S. and Western Europe.
Let's look at President Trump's notion of an Arab NATO, members of Egypt, United Arab Emirates, I think Bahrain. Tell me about that. How real would that be? And how would that affect the country?
I think the purpose, the idea of an Arab NATO refers to the Middle East Security Association, I believe it's called, loosely referred to as the Arab NATO, modeled somewhat loosely on NATO.
Right.
I think it was proposed 2 years ago by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia as an organization of Sunni Arab states. The Sunni states of the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia in particular, but others as well, Jordan and Egypt were the original proposed members. I don't believe the U.S. officially had a role in it, but unofficially, clearly, the U.S. was backing it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Israel was also very positive on the idea. The officially stated objective of it was to contain Iranian influence and, to some extent, Russian influence in the Middle East. So it was aimed particularly against Iran. There was obviously a religious angle because the principal states who would be the proposed members of this Arab NATO were predominantly Sunni in composition, aimed against a Shia Muslim state, Iran. So clearly there was a religious component. It hasn't gone that well. Egypt withdrew from the discussions, and they are unlikely to actually join any such organization. Egypt was a key country. So it looked like it's going to be pretty much Gulf states, as well as Jordan, at this point. Mm-hmm. To the best of my knowledge, negotiations on the formation of this group are still proceeding.
So it's still a possibility. Candidate Trump, back in, I guess, 2015, was stating that he felt NATO at that point was obsolete. Did he base that position on the financial contributions towards weaponry, or was there some other? I mean, it seems like he's always tied up in the finances of things. Why did he feel that way, and where is he now?
Well, Trump, since the beginning of his campaign for president, has always made noises about doubting the value of NATO, and he's really the first president, to my knowledge, since Harry S. Truman, who's contemplated the possibility of a world without NATO. Normally that was a sacrosanct issue. Trump has opened the sort of can of worms of whether or not NATO is really that valuable. And the principal objection was, yes, the financial one, that it's very expensive, that the U.S., one of the purposes of NATO is to have U.S. soldiers and bases on European soil, and that his complaint was that the European states aren't spending enough on their militaries, pointing, I believe, above all to Germany, which spends, at present, I believe, a little over 1% of its GDP on the military, as opposed to the U.S., which spends over 3% of its GDP on the military. And so the objection was that if the Europeans aren't paying a sufficient share, the U.S. would consider withdrawing from NATO. As far as I can tell, these have only been noises that Trump has made, and Trump has taken no action to remove the U.S. from NATO. On the contrary, I would say his concrete actions, as opposed to his verbal verbiage, has been to strengthen NATO in practice. So I don't think this has really gone anywhere. I do think the principal significance of these verbal criticisms of NATO has been to alarm the foreign policy establishment. And I would see it that a lot of the hostility of the intelligence services that we've seen displayed towards Trump, and to some extent elements of the military, the uniformed military, derive from the criticisms of NATO and the questioning, the open public questioning of whether or not NATO is of any value. But to me, this overstates the issue in that, in terms of concrete actions, he's done nothing to weaken NATO.
I see. And just looking at the mission, if you will, now here in 2020, I know that nuclear weapons and storage had been a concern. But also I'm curious to know what your thought is on NATO's role in protecting, in cybersecurity. Could you speak on those?
I'm not an expert on cybersecurity, and I can't really discuss that with any authority. I would assume the country that has the most capability in that area would be the United States. It would probably be enhanced by cooperation with other states. that would be the main consideration. I think the most important use of NATO really is as a make-work program for high-ranking military officers on both sides of the Atlantic, for weapons producers, and as a kind of prestige symbol of American power in Europe. As an instrument of international security, I don't really see it as much value, and as far as I can tell, it's increased insecurity in the world by creating a conflict with Russia that didn't exist before and probably would not exist without NATO. So it seems to me it's largely an insecurity-generating institution, a very expensive one, I should add, and the value of it is very open to question, I think. And so, I think you're getting one contrived justification for NATO after another, but when looked at under scrutiny, these justifications don't really hold up very well.
I see. So I was looking recently at an article, I guess it was from December 16th, NATO declares space, quote, operational domain, but more work remains. We have about, 7 or 8 minutes with you. Could you touch upon the domain of NATO, and do you see it expanding into space, and how that might look?
Trump has created a space command, and using satellites and anti-satellite weapons has long been a U.S. Military activity. Most of intelligence is gathered through space presence through satellites. And I assume the military is looking into offensive possibilities. What those might look like, I don't know, since I'm not an expert in these areas. And quite naturally, there's an effort to engage NATO in this area, as there's constantly an effort to engage NATO in all areas, again, to give it a function. But I don't see any defensive purpose for this that would enhance anybody's security. On the contrary, I would assume this would increase insecurity, as most of what NATO has been doing has been increasing insecurity. I suppose one thing I would like to touch on is the issue of the U.S. conflict with Russia.
Yes. I
did want to go into that a little bit so we have a little time. Is the origins of this was an agreement the United States had made with the Soviet Union in its last days in 1990. The United States agreed never to expand NATO to the east. Not 1 inch to the east was the public U.S. declaration. If the Soviet Union would agree to allow the reunification of Germany and would not block it on the Security Council, the Soviet Union agreed to this and allowed Germany to reunify. And as soon as that was done, the United States began to expand NATO, first into East Germany, and then in the 90s into, I believe it was first Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and then expanded considerably from there. The Russian standpoint on this is that this has been a violation of a publicly stated agreement by the United States not to expand NATO. And their efforts to expand NATO further, to incorporate, for example, the Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And the Russians see this as an effort to bring NATO right up to the heart of their borders. And would see this, I'd say, in the same light as America would see it if let's say, the Russians tried to establish a military alliance and bases in Mexico. And they see this as very threatening to them. And that was something that was really quite unnecessary, and so far as I can tell, was indeed something that originated in a violation of an agreement by the United States. And I just don't see how this enhances anybody's security or why it was necessary to take this action.
Right. Just real quickly, NATO's position or in relation to China. Do you have any comments on that?
I haven't really seen much on that. There is still mostly an effort to keep NATO in Europe, although there's been a major effort to get NATO involved what's called out-of-area operations. In, for example, Afghanistan and Iraq, I haven't really seen anything specifically on China per se.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that. Do you feel that NATO is obsolete? Do you feel it doesn't have a place? Do you feel it doesn't know who it is? These member countries, is it viable and is it doing a service for our world?
Well, it's certainly viable in the sense that it's existed for 30 years without the Cold War, and it could exist for another 30 years if people wish to spend the money to finance it, and there's the will to keep it going, which it seems to be at the moment there is. But as I noted, I just don't see any value to it in terms of enhancing security. On the contrary, it's provoking a new Cold War with Russia. And that's very dangerous since Russia has 1,000 active nuclear warheads. People tend to forget that. I'd say the main benefit, if you want to call it a benefit, is it enhances America's prestige as the world's dominant power, and it enables a lot of American influence in Europe. But that's separate from security. If you're interested in security, I'd say NATO has no function at all. Quite the contrary. It's an insecurity-generating institution. And I think the main consideration in Washington among the foreign policy establishment is that NATO is a symbol of American power, and they want to keep it going on that basis. And the expense in terms of the financial expense, or expense in terms of weakened world security, is seen as a secondary consideration.
Even though United States is putting in over $700 billion for a symbolism, if you will, does that make sense? I mean, that's what it seems. Go ahead.
I'm a social scientist, and we're always reluctant to take sort of partisan stands on things. And I would say that basically there is a very strong, and I think growing skepticism, if not hostility, among the mass public to expenditures on sort of, I don't know, what are essentially prestige expenditures that really don't enhance people's quality of life. I think there are a lot of people maybe who would think that the United States would be better served spending that money on things like, reviving cities like Detroit or rural Nebraska.
Education,
we're doing things like, fighting international transmission of disease, if you want to look at it in an international scale. That might be a better use of the money from the standpoint of some. And so, one has to ask, basically, why did we keep... We never really had a debate on NATO, which we should have had. I think there was just an assumption that if you have a large bureaucratic institution, you don't dismantle it. You find some new justification for it, and that's what we've been doing.
Right. Dr. Gibbs, we are just about out of time, and I would like to briefly talk about your new book, How America Became a Right-Wing Nation, in the couple minutes that we have. Could you just briefly tell us what it's about?
Well, in the 1970s, you really had a real shift to the right, and I think it was an effort to get rid of social spending on the welfare state. It was an effort to essentially redistribute money upwards and to increase the skew in the distribution of wealth in favor of the more wealthy classes. And it was largely the result of lobbying by business groups. I mean, that's the very short version of it, but I would say the main consideration of the shift to the right was investment of very high sums of money by businesses and wealthy individuals acting in their own interests. And I think the origins, basically, of a much more skewed distribution of wealth can be traced back to these decisions in the 1970s.
Right. So the name of that book, when is it coming out, by the way?
Well, I'm only about 60% done writing it. So it'll be a year or two, maybe. I'd say maybe 2-3 years before it's actually on the shelves.
Wonderful. And that book is going to be How America Became a Right-Wing Nation. Dr. Gibbs, we are delighted that you've spent this first 30 minutes with us, and we hope that you will come back, perhaps when that new book is out. Thank you so much, Professor Gibbs. Professor Gibbs is a professor of history at the University of Arizona and has published widely on the Democratic Republic of Congo, the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and NATO.